Welcome everybody. I am Sharon Reed. I am the Programs and Events Coordinator for the Hood Museum of Art, Dartmouth. And welcome to this virtual Conversations and Connections. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Amelia Kahl, Barbara C. and Harvey P. Hood, 1918 Curator of Academic Programming and moderator for today's program.
Hello everybody, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. So I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on native land. And for those of us on the panel who are presenting today, we are on the ancestral lands of the Abenaki peoples and the Wabanaki Confederacy. And thinking Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth is situated upon the ancestral and unceded lands of the Abenaki people. This acknowledgement reminds us of the significance of place, the continued existence of indigenous people, and the museum and Dartmouth's commitment to respectful relationships with those who call these lands home today. So thank you to our three speakers for joining us here this afternoon.
Hi everybody, Jon Ippolito here. I couldn't resist making this meme a few minutes ago to load up to the slide deck. And I'm trying to, I'm doing that because I want to think about the ways that we can imagine harnessing the power of digital communities and their enthusiasm for museums, because museums are in a tough place, right? Our galleries are shuttered, the travel to our cities is choked off. The pandemic has people worried about being in public spaces and seeing artwork in the flesh, alongside other things in the flesh that might infect them. So what do we do about that? Well, there, as you know, has been a renewed interest in inventive ways of representing the space of our museums in a smartphone screen or a desktop computer or even a virtual reality headset. So this, for those of us who've been in the business for a while, this sounds familiar, this kind of obsession with the digital reinvention of galleries and museums and cultural spaces in general. It sounds a lot like what happened around 2000 in the dot-com boom, when museums like the Whitney and San Francisco MoMA, in my case, the Guggenheim, started to reinvent themselves and imagine completely new ways that people could engage with this stuff using digital technologies. So what I want to do, and what my fellow panelists are going to do, is to try to kind of look back at some of those precedents and see, have we learned the lessons from the dot-com boom and its promises, or are we making those mistakes all over again? And or are there new things that we've been exploring that are different than the way things were 20 years ago? So let's start with better content. You can go to the next slide. Great, so the world's tallest building. I'm going to reach back to one of my favorite examples of crowdsourcing, which of course is the enlisting of ordinary folks to help with tasks normally given to experts or to staff, professional staff. I'm going to reach back to the net art of the 1990s, where a lot of stuff happened outside of the realm of institutions that we might later look on as a model or consider to be examples of museum-like behavior. This is a particularly creative example, I think. And if you want to click on the link and show the house that resulted from this, Mr. Wong's Soupartments, a German project in which someone basically invited people to add stories to an endless, seemingly endless tower. There was a sort of pixelated template that you could start from in this very 90s style artwork and just add your own floor to this giant skyscraper. What was amazing about it was not just the outpouring of buildings. It's far higher than, you know, if you kind of stacked up all the floors, the Empire State Building or any of the tallest buildings in reality. But it also had a fairly high level of quality. And this is something that I think we can learn from when we think about crowdsourcing. One of the major fears that museums have is that, yeah, you know, maybe I will end up with some more support for my collection if people, annotate my metadata using some kind of online form, or if they bring things to the museum, what's to stop them from just lowering the standards that I have as a gatekeeping curator. Well, one of the lessons to be learned from this Mr. Wong's Soupartments was that the very constraint of having to work from this template and add each pixel one at a time, you couldn't just make this thing in Photoshop, filtered out all the people who weren't really interested and were just coming to vandalize. It doesn't mean there aren't moments that are kind of subversive, like that sheep that's squashed in there, and there's another one where people are jackhammering away at the tower to destroy it. But it does mean that, ironically, raising the bar sometimes can be a strategy for making crowdsourcing work. If we go back to the slides for a bit, we can see some more contemporary versions. If you go to the next one. Okay, so then the question becomes, well, have there been any studies? Okay, it's one thing to have a bunch of crazy artists, add pixels to some fanciful building, but what about actual work, scholarly kind of research that needs to be done by curators and critics and academics? Yochai Benkler wrote a book called The Wealth of Networks, in which he examined a number of early cases in which people employed crowdsourcing. And this was, again, outside of a museum context, early internet stuff, 1990s. The NASA crater locators were a bunch of people who went and identified basically images or depressions in the lunar and Martian surface that looked like they would be craters. And you would think that no one in her or his right mind would possibly accept this task. Another parallel project from the humanities was Project Gutenberg, which many of you may know was predecessor to Google Books, where people basically typed in examples of famous texts such as Shakespeare and so forth, so that these could be turned into websites and made available for people to read online. Both of these projects had an enormous numbers of participants. And it's one thing to type in Shakespeare, okay, I get that, but like actually literally going through these square miles of the lunar surface and identifying dots that could be craters, that to me is like insane amount of dedication. But for some reason, people were obsessed with it. And Benkler cites studies to the effect that the transcription of these works of literature in Project Gutenberg, as well as the identification of craters, was higher accuracy than when done by professionals. And as a former astrophysicist, I can say that I am both embarrassed for my field, but also impressed at the passion and dedication of people who, for no apparent reason, went and identified craters on Mars. You can show the next slide. In the news more recently, the death of Flash. I'm sure many of you have seen these little pop-up things on your laptops that say, sorry, but you're going to have to deinstall Flash soon. Adobe's killing it because Steve Jobs killed it, because Flash kind of killed itself. Long story there, but suffice to say that for those of us who remember the glory days of web design in the early 2000s, when every site was suddenly liquid and animated, or played, maybe your kids played Flash games from many of these online sites. It's kind of sad to see it go. Classic example of digital obsolescence, a very popular platform lasting, 10 years, if that. But again, crowdsourcing to the rescue, in this case, fan-led preservation, in which those aficionados, in this case, not of astrophysics or literature, but of video games, created their own emulators outside of the context of academic research or museum or official preservation channels. And those emulators are now used by online sites like the Internet Archive, Sewn It Right, to reinvigorate, resuscitate these Flash games, so you can actually go and play the animations that you might have known from 15 years ago. And I know my kids love it. It wouldn't exist if it was up to preservation professionals. It's really the amateurs who brought that to being. Next slide. So one other project I want to focus on, and then I'll let you go, is Spotvogel. So this was a video labeling game from the present day. So now I'm looking at something that's happened now that might learn from or reflect some of these innovations from the past. The goal was here, it's one thing to sort of like take an image and correct a caption or, maybe even identify points on a map. It's a different thing to sit through an entire video. It takes a long time. And for, curators and other staff at cash and personnel-strapped museums, crowdsourcing is one way to think about, like, how do I categorize all these videos? So in this case, they were based on a documentary show in the Netherlands. There were several versions. This one is to identify birds that you see in the video. And the setup was very similar to what you may know of the kind of reCAPTCHA cybersecurity app that you sometimes have to check off when you're trying to log into a website and prove you're a human. The idea was that if two different people identify the bird with the same name, then they're likely to be correct. So it wasn't one-off individuals, it was a game that you played with one other person. And that gamification is something that kind of combines the passion of the communities that contributed to the crater locators, because birders are a famously passionate group, plus the game dynamic that motivated the people who wrote emulators so they could play their vintage video games again. And I think the unity of those two features made Spotvogel especially successful. There's some other things to be learned from Spotvogel, though, and you can see that on the next slide. So on the left, you see tags added by the percent of players, and you notice that the number of, as the number of players, or I should say, as the number of tags per person went up, which is the orange, the number of players who contributed them went down, which is just another way of saying, like, a few people contributed a lot of tags. Most people, a couple of tags. There was an average of, I think, 6 minutes spent on the website, which is actually a lot given that you're just looking at birds and like tagging them per person. But, the average person contributed, maybe, 10 tags. And then once you got to maybe the top 10%, they had 100 tags. And then the top, 1% had thousands of tags. And then there were some people who just churned out tags, thousands and thousands of tags. We see this dynamic in a lot of participatory systems today. You notice that, for example, I just saw that Wikipedia had the billionth edit like this week in the English language version. That's an extraordinary number of edits, but it doesn't mean that they all, of the whatever 7 billion people on the planet, 1 in 7 has contributed a Wikipedia edit. No, there's some people who just are much more dedicated to the community and contribute more often. You'll also notice, though, on the right that when those bird videos that had the most tags didn't necessarily have the highest accuracy. In fact, sometimes it was just those that had fewer tags. So your goal is not necessarily to get as many people tagging as possible if you're interested in accuracy. However, that might not be your goal. And Johan Oman, who worked on Spotvogel, says the main goal of crowdsourcing is actually not to get help with your collection. It's not to get perfect metadata. It's really to engage your public. And that is a goal that is increasingly important in the time of the pandemic. I'll just show one more slide, I think, which is for those of you who want to get involved in crowdsourcing, like, hey, I've got this collection, I have no idea how to even get started. Here are two applications that do kind of like a low-hanging fruit version of crowdsourcing, which is just transcription, right? Like, I've got stuff on the left from the page, is a paid service, but it has a free tier where you basically, give someone a manuscript, handwritten letter, back of a photograph, whatever it might be, and then ask the world, the universe, the internet to transcribe it. And on the right, Scripto is a more sort of versatile plugin for Omeka, which is a popular museum collection service. And this one basically adds a wiki onto your collection so people can add all kinds of different data. But those are two places that you can play around with crowdsourcing. And I welcome questions about how to make better content through crowdsourcing.
Great, thank you, John. Meredith, do you have a response?
I see a lot of sort of crowdsourcing that happens with text-based material. or have, a lot of firepower. The example that, we brought up in some of the ideation was this, so a lot of the Smithsonian's abilities to get crowdsourcing. And I'm thinking about how museums can scale it down and what does scalable crowdsourcing look like? And then the other thing which you sort of started to address, which I want to just dig in, is that sort of field of dreams approach that museums seem to have that doesn't really work. And your point of you have to engage the community where they are. So is there anything sort of weird or out there that you think of that you love and that aren't necessarily just text translations? Like, again, Smithsonian had people tagging contraceptives, which I thought was really cool.
Two examples. One, a pandemic-friendly one and one not. The pandemic-friendly one is, I almost put a slide up of all those fabulous examples of people posting on Instagram and elsewhere where they recreate a painting in their own backyard or their living room or something with their cat. So it's a Madonna and child, but it's like a woman with a cat and she's wearing a tablecloth instead of a shawl and so on. And those are fabulous. They're great examples. It's so easy to do if you just put a page full of paintings on your front page of your museum and say, hey, recreate these at home and use this hashtag and we'll feature you on our social media. That's super low hanging fruit, no words, for a very visual person. The other example, it's not pandemic friendly, but that I also really love is there was a museum, I'm trying to remember which one in England, that did an exhibition about World War I. And they asked people from the community to just bring in an object from that period. Didn't have to be, a weapon or unexploded bomb. It could be like just some letter that, their relative wrote or some clothing of the period. And this is a small museum that, had maybe, a couple dozen people, visit over the week. And they were just mobbed. Just people came in. They went, what is this thing? I want to talk about this thing. And suddenly, it was like the collection just blew outside of the doors and became something that was in everybody's home that they brought into the museum. Added value, not just to the museum experience, but also to what these people brought back to them.
Bill Stimler, if you would like to unmute and ask your question.
Oh, well, thank you. John, just a question for you. Why do you think it is that museums are hesitant to build these connectors to have more crowdsourced contributions on top of their systems? Is it security? Is it a perception of authority? The underlying technology seems to exist in many instances, but it's not being supported by institutional leaders, and their staff are not being empowered to bring these things forward in many instances.
Absolutely, Neil. And Neil, a lot of these technologies at least as well and sometimes better than I do, so I appreciate your question. I'd be interested in your take. I really think it's the gatekeeping mentality more than anything, and that fear of the unknown goes beyond the kind of rational cybersecurity concern, which of course, if you're going to do an SQL injection into someone's metadata, that's a bad thing for your website. But I think it really has more to do with the fact, and I'm going to totally generalize here, but in high school, everybody decided, am I good at math or not? And a lot of people who weren't went into the arts. And so we have people who are kind of technophobes who are, gravitate toward art history and related fields, and present company accepted. But I think that has resulted in an anxiety about digital technology in general, and then specifically with this idea that, well, if anyone can do it, how can it be good? Or how do we maintain relevance as a brick and mortar museum with, Picassos and Mondrians when people are creating all this content out there in TikTok and Instagram?
Thank you, Jon Ippolito. I'd like to move on to John Bell, our next presenter.
To follow up on what John was talking about in terms of looking back at the history of what we've done and where we've been and trying to figure out where that might send us, I want to talk about access a little bit, and particularly what digital access to museums looks like. If you can go to the next slide. We will start way back early web era, 94, when Web Louvre was created. This was an independent site, which is why it was sued until it had to rename itself Web Museum. But its intention was to put artwork out there for people to see. The fact is that when this was archived, the copy that you're looking at now was originally archived in 1996, I believe, and carried forward. the technology was allowing people to now go out and see things, to access information, but we weren't really putting it together in ways that were really supportive of narratives and curation, things like that. That doesn't mean that base access wasn't good and helpful. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that the, whoops, we don't have, oh, there we go. You'll see that on the left, this is the image of Mona Lisa that was in Web Museum in 1994 originally. The modern day Louvre site doesn't even give you as high a resolution image as the one from 1994 that was unofficial. You can say, you know, the color is different and image quality is perhaps better on the new one, but the resolution is lower. I think that this is really starting to show that a lot of museum sites haven't moved beyond that base mechanism. A lot of them are based on what I would think of as a sort of database collection or aesthetic, where it's a list of artwork objects that have a certain set of properties associated with them, and you just choose a property and start browsing through them. If you could go to the next slide, you see this go forward no matter what kind of content it is that we're talking about. So the Museum of Other Realities is a project that's really great. It's got lots of interesting content in it, virtual reality artworks. You can download a application to browse through them on your VR headset. On the website, they're represented essentially in the same way as the artworks on Web Museum or the official Louvre website were. It's still very much that object-oriented nature. You can do a little bit more with it than just that, though. If you go to the next slide, the Smithsonian is starting to go in a direction where, okay, we'll give you objects, but we'll at least give you the freedom to play with the objects a little bit. We won't restrict you to the images that we've taken and put up as a canned resource. So the Smithsonian, for some of the objects in their collection, are starting to release 3D models of these artifacts. It's wonderful that you can now take a look at them, and within a web browser, the viewer allows you to actually rotate and pan and zoom. Could you go with the next slide, please? That gives you a lot of freedom that you wouldn't have gotten in the sort of more traditional model where you're just given a bunch of JPEGs, because you can actually look at things that in some cases you wouldn't even be able to see in an actual museum in person. So here you can zoom in on the top right, but on the bottom right, you can also turn it around and look at the back, and that might even be, you know, the way that it's mounted in a museum. It may not ever be visible to you. So that's nice from a sort of access perspective, but the Smithsonian is also going a step further and allowing users to download these meshes, do with as they wish with them within certain constraints, 3D print them so you can actually see them yourself as a physical object. So that's a wonderful progression. It still is that sort of object-oriented bag of artifacts, though, in a lot of ways. It's not to say that we haven't tried to do things that are a little bit more cohesive or coherent than that over time. Could you go to the next slide, please? So I won't show you the old Vermal VRML museums from the early 90s because they're kind of painful to look at this point, plus it's VRML and it doesn't work anymore anyways for the most part. But moving forward a little bit in time, there have been a lot of other examples of trying to create virtual spaces where you can not just have individual artifacts up on screen, but start to create curated shows. For instance, in Second Life, there were a lot of examples of this. The Verdun Museum is one that I think is interesting because it takes the sort of skeuomorphic nature of trying to create a virtual museum to the nth degree. If you look at the screenshot on the left, it looks like a museum you would walk up to in person. They've simulated galleries over on the right. They've gone as far as creating a gift shop, because you can't have a museum without a gift shop, clearly. The question that I would have, though, is this skeuomorphism actually helping access, and is it actually helping present the work in the best way, or is it what we're defaulting to because that's what we know from the real world? If you go to the next slide, another example of this is if you go into a relatively new platform, at least compared to Second Life, Mozilla Hubs, there are a number of these little pop-up, we'll call them museums, galleries, something to that effect, that are in there. This one I really like for the name, if nothing else. It is the Museum of the Fossilized Internet. You can go into this with up to 20-ish other people and walk around inside of a room to participate in the artwork. I'm specifically saying participate there because within Hubs, you have all of the tools necessary to create just like you would in Second Life, but you also have tools that allow you to essentially clone models across different platforms and across different environments and rooms. So the openness of Mozilla Hubs is another step in the direction of transforming away from that model of putting objects up on websites and hoping for the best. Next slide, please. There's a tendency to blame this, or maybe blame isn't the right word. No, we'll go with blame. To blame this progression of access on a progression of technology. That's true maybe to a certain extent. So you can see over on the top left here, Sensorama was a very early prototype of what might now be called a virtual reality device. And we've tried this many times over the years. We've thrown Virtual Boy in there. Nowadays, it's considered a relatively cheap headset to buy with the Oculus Quest, which is a couple $100 to give you a relatively high quality experience. I would argue, though, that for our purposes, the technology that's important, yeah, okay, the output technology is, but it's really the technology that's used to create the experiences for people. So the bottom row of images are how you create for each of these platforms, other than the Virtual Boy that we don't talk about. If you really want to, there's something called the Virtual Boy Sacred Text Scroll that will explain to you exactly how you create content for it. Suffice it to say that it's way more time than we have right now. But because we now have tools for creation as much as consumption, we're able to throw the doors open a little bit. If you could go to my next slide, please. I just want to finish up with this project that we've been working on here. Carol Kawiaka, who's an architect and artist who teaches here at Dartmouth, had this idea that she wanted to explore the Las Meninas painting and try to answer some of the questions about how space works within it, because there are some sort of odd things going on in there. Once you free up the tools of creativity a little bit, you're able to do things like recreate this space in 3D and then allow people to jump in and walk through it. So she sort of planned this out. We helped her create this, and now if you go to that URL down at the bottom, you can go into Mozilla Hubs with a bunch of other people and wander around inside the painting to see what's going on. This is not only now taking, going from a sort of object-oriented view of museums to a more cohesive view, but it's turning the artwork themselves into locations for experimentation and for discovery and labs in their own right. There's a lot that can be done with this in the future. I think that it's really just a question of trying to understand what it is that we want to do. Is the goal of the museum to be a collection of objects, or is the goal to put these things out in the world for people to explore in their own way?
Great. Thank you so much, John. In order to keep us on track, I'm going to invite our third presenter, Meredith Steinfels, to start, and then we'll take everybody's questions at the end.
So better tools, and I say that sort of loosely because I think when we say tools, we're thinking of hardware or software application, but let's be a little squishy with that word. So can you go ahead and advance to the next slide? And I'll explain. You won't see what that picture is in a bit. So to take it back a little bit, museum cataloging as a practice is not new. It's not even close to being new. We've been categorizing and classifying things since time immemorial. And electronic cataloging is also not a new thing. However, there's sort of that switch from that really unfriendly DOS interface to something that's a little bit kind of more presentable to the user, although curators might argue with me and I would agree with them. Although there was a museum in 2009 I encountered that still had a DOS interface. But largely, they all sort of did the same thing. They identified the problem. We need a friendlier cataloging system that's digital. We need it to have this information and we need it to behave in this way. The problem was answered and museums kind of quote unquote standard cataloging software was made. So I have a slide, or my slide has several different cataloging softwares. I think there are 3 different owners. These are 5 different softwares. And if you notice, they all sort of look the same. There's a metadata header and there's a box, metadata header box, metadata header box. And the software on the top right, I've been working with for 10 years and it has not fundamentally changed, even though cataloging practices have. And the way that we think about things has, the software has not. It is very, very rigid. The questions that we're answering now, they can't really be answered functionally by these softwares. And it imposes the wrong set of values. Amelia, can you advance the slide, please? So this is just a fun picture of data, very broadly. And, you know, as museum staff sort of are growing more aware, they're realizing that there's different ways of knowing, that there's uncertainty, there's intangible events, there's relationships to land, to self, to time. And again, these aren't new concepts, but these are concepts that, as John has talked about earlier, that we are a little slower to grasp. And we need to be able to solve for that in a system that is inherently binary, which is that data is there or it isn't. So how do we kind of get around that? Could you go to the next slide, please? So this is a screenshot of the CIDOC conceptual reference model. And it sort of seeks to allow for things like uncertainty and sort of these crazy relationships by creating a system for these multitudes between disparate entities, capturing the event and the object. So in this slide, this is Johann Winkelmann and his relationship to Laocoon and Sons. All of these sort of different boxes represent that relationship. So just very quickly, Laocoon was a Trojan high priest, and the god sent giant serpents to attack him and his sons. And for those who have not seen the artwork, it's brutal, but to Winkelmann, he thought it was the epitome of beauty. And I really apologize to any classical scholars in the audience for my sort of dumbing down of that explanation. But the point is that CIDOC tries to explain that, but the thing is it's high concept, and it's, you know, unless you really have the appetite to go down that wormhole, it's not necessarily an accessible way, and nor does it necessarily fit into these sort of very tightly created systems. So go ahead and advance the slide. So those of you who know me know I evangelize a lot about open data and openness. And so again, not something new, but sort of these shortcomings of these very rigid softwares are being amplified as everybody is forced to use them now. Curators and other museum staff who usually were physically present and could access the collections physically or access the object files in paper or their own notes at their desks were now forced to use these systems that don't think like they think and are less organic. And so enter the open community. Open access, open data, open source, looking at shared governance models and ceding authority to the collective. And these standards and these enterprise tools that were developed don't necessarily harness that. So I don't have an answer as, oh, we should use this tool, but I do want to spotlight a few that were developed for and by the community because I want to talk about openness. So the first slide here is a IIIF viewer. So IIIF stands for International Image Interoperability Framework. And it was created for and by museum workers and it's free to use, it's free to adopt as a way to basically view artworks. And if you notice, you have 4 viewers in this screen. 2 of them are looking at these mermaids with bifurcated tails, but you can zoom, you can compare, you can suddenly manipulate and use and look at art in a new way. And all you have to do is open up part of yourselves. And you can pull in, artwork from other people's collection. And in this case, in Bellissima, you also have the data that's open as well. So go ahead and advance the slide. Another example in the wild is Harvard Art Museums. A lot of art museums are adopting sort of IIIF compliant viewers in their websites. And then what you end up having is this really sort of beautiful interaction with the texture of an object that you wouldn't normally have. So on the left is some bobbin lace, and on the right is with the IIIF viewer, I'm able to see the individual's linen stitches in this bobbin. And again, it's just a very simple, we're adding this one level of compliance. And now anybody who has their own sort of compliance software can now access this. And the end user, you, me, anybody can also access this picture. And then go to the next slide. The other thing that I wanted to spotlight were indigenous knowledges. The Reciprocal Research Network in particular is an open data community developed by the Musqueam Indian Band, the Stolo Nation and Tribal Council, the Umisa Cultural Society, and the Museum of Anthropology. And it is an open data community for and by Native Americans and Canadian First Nations in the Pacific Northwest. And what it allows people to do is add content, but then what it also allows descendant communities to do is access that content, talk about that content, and contribute to that content. So there was a slide earlier that I apologize for that was up at the beginning, could also be here, but it shows what happens when your data is open. It shows what happens when you're willing to bring your information out, which is one of them was somebody correcting. I think it might have actually been this. If you look at the title, somebody called it an eagle sculpture. Somebody else, I believe, actually said, no, this is a thunderbird. We've had, you see in Reciprocal Research Network, people identifying themselves as the artist. Oh, I painted this totem pole. Somebody else noted that a mask belonged to their great-great-uncle. So again, this sort of allowing for different ways of knowledge is happening outside of the database and also creating more and more levels and layers of access. Can you advance the slide? The other thing is traditional knowledge labels. These were created by Local Context, which was founded by Jane Anderson and Kim Christian in 2010. And this is, I'm going to read just from their website, which is the primary objectives of Local Context are to enhance and legitimize locally based decision-making in indigenous governance frameworks for determining ownership, access, and culturally appropriate conditions for sharing historical, contemporary, and future collections of cultural heritage and indigenous data. Local Context is focused on increasing indigenous involvement in data governance through the integration of indigenous values into data systems. And so what these labels do is they allow for indigenous and descendant communities to express the conditions of use of an object. You know, this object, use it for sharing, use it for teaching. This is what it's made for. And then you see there's a whole host of them. So I believe that ours that we had on the slide was the outreach one. But again, it's like why I said tools is sort of a squishy term, because it's not necessarily use a new software, but it's rethink how governance works and respond accordingly.
Great, thank you, Meredith. So we do have a few minutes to take some questions. Garcia Cepeda, I just saw you, and maybe now you have disappeared. So I'm going to ask you to unmute if you would like to ask your question. I think something about crowdsourcing and.
Yes. Hi, John. So my question was about, do you think that like crowdsourcing the digitalization of actual objects, like heritage objects, say sculptures, paintings, etc., could be crowdsourced? Or is that like condemned forever to be a institutional attribution? Museums will always be the ones in charge of that. Like they will never like give the public the access to digitize these things.
Yeah, that's a great question. Fortunately, we know that there are examples that are not doing that, right? It certainly could happen, and museums have that tendency of kind of taking things in and not pushing things back out. I think that's one of their biggest drawbacks to date. Remember that crowdsourcing is different from open source, right? People often think of those as equivalent, but crowdsourcing is when you put out a call for something and people respond within a very limited set of parameters. And open source is more like, hey, here's stuff, do what you want with it. If you want to join my thread, then I'll merge your stuff into mine. But if I don't like that and you want to start your own fork, go for it, right? And there are, most of the museum efforts to enlist participation have been the former, the crowdsourcing. We set the terms, you give us the stuff, thanks very much. But there are some museums that have tried other approaches, notably the Cooper Hewitt with Seb Chan, putting their entire collection metadata on GitHub and saying, here, guys, go with it, do whatever you want. And some really interesting projects have come out of that open sourcing of data.
Yeah, I was thinking that there are different layers of artistic creativity when you have, for instance, that bobbin lace, and then if people can't come and see it in person, if they see it, digitalized, that there's a layer of creativity of what to choose to present that will spark the person's interest in looking at it.
Yeah, definitely. And another good thing, I want to say it's at the Clifford Still Museum. That's also a really good way to spark creativity, is that this technology allows for what's called slow looking. So museums with a little bit of firepower and time have been creating what they're calling slow looking journeys, where you actually click on play and they walk you through this very meditative look of the painting. And Clifford Still is a really good example because just of the way the art works. I'll type in the name in the chat, but if you want to take a look at that, it's really just sort of calming and meditative, and it also allows you to really focus on a very sort of small detail. And it's something that normally we do in person, right? You know, we go in front of a painting that makes us think and we stare at it. And this sort of technology allows for you to do that, but for you to do that in a different situation and for you to kind of rewind and think.
Great. Thank you, Meredith. Mary Flanagan, I see that you had a question a little while ago about gender. Would you like to unmute and ask that question to the panelists?
Yeah, hi everybody. I was just wondering, there used to be a researcher at Dartmouth who has since left who was spearheading a lot of the research in crowdsourcing and gender, and I haven't kept up on that particular set of data, but it seemed like a good 10, 15 years ago, it was something that the statistics were pretty bad, like something like 11% of Wikipedia editors were women, and so crowdsourcing sounds egalitarian, but really who's actually crowdsourcing is not an equal number. We could probably see that in Reddit participation and other kind of pretty much anywhere. So yeah. So my question, I guess that's for all of the panelists actually, because you've all taken on in different ways or thought about this probably, is how do you target underrepresented groups specifically without that kind of dubious extractive invitation to participate for no actual monetary gain or something like that, but actually just for participation in culture that seems a little bit possibly not even yours to begin with.
I can't figure out why my camera keeps going off, but I was going to say that I wouldn't ask for additional labor from an underrepresented community without compensation in the first place. That's like not a satisfactory answer, but if I'm going to go out of my way to say I need you and I need your representation, I need your participation, then I'm going to need to come up with the funding.
Right, but isn't it true that crowdsourcing I've done a lot of crowdsourcing projects, so I implicate myself here. But the question of unpaid digital labor is a large and interesting question. But if we think that something like Wikipedia is about participation or it doesn't exist, and the majority of people participating are male, at least a while back, and I'm curious to see if there's data on this. It just begs a question about who is participating and who perhaps is already compensated in some other way by their participation. Anyway, perhaps it's a provocation, but the data did show a very, very unequal gender split a while back, and I don't know if that many people are really even thinking about that. And yeah, the Art and Feminism Network is definitely doing that, but it's because of that data that we know to do it.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. We have time for just one more question. And I know Lennox had a question. If you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
I just had a question when you talked about the Adobe software, and if you could go a little further on the significance of, I guess, the elimination of the software and why it's a significant transition in the digital media sphere.
Yeah, I could speak a little bit about that. Web design in the 1990s was largely a matter of tables and colored text and random images scattered throughout the page. When Flash came along, it suddenly created a visual runtime environment that was appealing to artists because it was WYSIWYG. You didn't really have to code. You could if you wanted to get fancy and make very dynamic systems, but you could also just kind of throw things on the page and make things move from one end to another. There were a lot of problems with Flash. It was not open source. You couldn't see the code directly. Google couldn't find text that was in it. It was a security hole and a memory hog and so on. I'm actually glad that it didn't dominate the web, as I was worried at some time. And HTML5 and JavaScript have done a great job of taking over from that. But what I think is sad is that perhaps because the artists no longer had a toolbox that looked like an artistic palette, web design has become incredibly sterile and uniform, in my opinion, over the last few years. Everything is a WordPress site with 100% width banners that you scroll through. And that's not, if you looked at the world of web design circa 2000, you'd see a dramatically more vibrant, diverse ecosystem than you see today. So I think the people that miss Flash so much are either the people who are really into dynamic interaction, being able to make that happen, or just the variety of different things that you saw online. There's no reason why you can't do those things with today's tools, but for some reason, I think when we lost Flash, we lost a lot of designers and creative people along with it.
Great, thank you.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody. Amelia, thank you so much for doing an incredible job moderating today. A warm thank you to Meredith and Jon for that wonderfully rich presentation. And thank you to all of you who joined us today for your contributions to the discussion. We do ask that you take a moment to complete a short survey that will be emailed tomorrow and encourage you to visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll find many of our recorded programs to view at your leisure.